Hi, hi, welcome back to the Perl Maven show. This is Gabor Sabo, and with me is Stevan Little, who is the author of Moose and tons of other things. And hi, Stevan.
Hi, Gabor. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. So the standard question: how did you start using Perl?
So actually, I didn't do much programming as a child or when I was younger, my teenage years or anything. I actually went to school for art. Did that for about 2 years, and then ended up dropping out of that. Realized it's not a it's a very difficult career to have. And then I kind of stumbled into it. A friend of mine told me. He'd been telling me I was waiting tables and things like that at the time. A friend of mine said, "Hey, you've got to learn Macromedia Director." And I said, "Okay, sure." And so I bought a book and I started learning it. And I called him up and he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, never mind, forget about Director. You got to learn HTML." So I kept sort of teaching myself these things, and then I started messing around with computers more and more. And then I eventually moved down to New York City and got a job during the first dot-com boom. And mostly I taught myself JavaScript at that point, and I did that for about maybe 2 or 3 years. And then I started teaching myself other languages. Let's see, I learned a little bit of Java, ATA 95, which is the programming language that was created by the U.S. Defense Department, which, unless you want to program missile guidance systems, is completely useless. But I actually that, and then I stumbled on Python and taught myself Python for a while, and then actually I got a job with the company I work for now, Infinity Interactive, about 11 years ago, and I was initially hoping we could do Python there, but the owner said, my boss said, no, 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 you've got to learn Perl. And so I was, oh no, I've got to learn Perl. But then I fell in love with it. So I started using it more and more, writing more just things on the side, just messing around, and just really kind of fell in love with Perl. And I haven't touched Python since. So
Not
yeah,
at all.
that's well a little bit here and there, but
Because I thought that you're sort of someone who's going out and looking around. I mean, you already knew a couple of languages before Perl.
yeah.
Um,
Well, no, I definitely like playing around with different languages. I just haven't made it back to Python in a long time. But yeah, that is one thing that I find. Well, I find languages in and of themselves very very interesting. Sort of it's kind of fascinating to me when you start to the more languages you learn, the more you see that they're really not that different. They all sort of boil down to sort of the same basic concepts.
okay.
And when you start learning functional programming languages and object-oriented languages and all these different kind of things, you begin to see all these commonalities across all the different kinds of languages. And just I don't know, I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I was wanted to ask whether that you're talking about specifically programming languages or also spoken languages. That
No, actually, you know what? I find spoken language is interesting too, but for whatever reason, I've never been able to learn another language other than English. I've tried. I lived in Germany for a little while when I was younger. My father worked for the government, so we moved around a lot. And I was there, and I learned maybe enough German to like order food and ask where the bathroom was, but that was pretty much about it. Um, I failed my Spanish class in high school, so for whatever reason, I can't pick up human languages, but computer languages I have no problem
oh,
with.
that's good.
So yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, well, so computer languages, and you brought into Perl, you built Moose, right?
Hmm. Yes, yeah.
And is that something that you brought in from some other language, or how did Moose get started, and why?
So actually, Moose was directly Perl 6 was directly responsible for Moose, essentially.
Okay.
In about 2005 or so, when Audrey Tang started the Pugs project, I was following her blog posts for a while about that, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. Someone's trying to do something with Perl 6, and so I happened to just decide one day I'm just going to hop on the IRC channel and sort of get an idea of what's going on. And then the project itself was just sort of a whirlwind of activity. It was actually a lot of fun. It was probably one of the most fun projects I've ever been involved in, and it was just because there was so much activity. There's so many people coming in and contributing and helping, and there was just Audrey was 24/7. She never stopped,
Yeah,
and so we we were building that. I started originally just sort of writing the tests, and I found Perl 6 very nice to write with. It had, well, exactly what Perl 6 is supposed to be. It's supposed to be Perl 5 with the improvements with less warts. And so I was really enjoying writing the Perl 6 code with the tests. And then at some point I got involved with trying to help figure out the object system in the meta model for Perl 6. And that's so probably 10 or 15 different experiments and prototypes later. I eventually got to a point where I'd essentially written what would eventually become Moose, and that it was still very Perl 6 oriented. So I did a lot of that, and then and during the course of all that, we did a lot of research in the Pugs project. We did a lot of research into other languages to sort of see what we could borrow from them. So at the time, Scala was a very young language, and we were looking at that specifically because they had traits, which are essentially what roles are. We also were looking at Ruby because Ruby is obviously very object oriented and also very inspired by Perl. So we were looking at sort of where that lines up. So a lot of those. A lot of that experimentation, a lot of that learning fed into what would eventually become Moose. So the actual reason why I built Moose was that the Pugs project sort of died down, and I basically found myself back at work writing plain old regular Perl 5 and really not enjoying it, or object-oriented Perl 5. And so I was craving the things that I'd gotten a taste for in Perl 6. And so I did another maybe 2 or 3 different prototypes, and basically ended up with class mop, which was the meta object protocol, and it was sort of the base of which Moose sits upon. And then actually I didn't know where to go after I made the mop, and Audrey Tang actually again sort of said, well, why don't you put a sugar layer on it? And so I thought, okay. And so I just sort of banged one out, and it sort of was what Moose was. And we also didn't know what to call it, but 2 of your compatriots, Galia Haas and Yuval Kogman, when we were trying to name it, they for whatever reason just found the word Moose hilarious. So when I said, well, what should we name it? They both said Moose. And so that was it. There's no actual acronym or anything like that associated with it. It just sounded funny to them, in a Hebrew accent, I think it was, that made it so funny for them. But anyway, so so Moose was really born out of Perl 6, but all of the sort of research and experimentation that we did during the Pugs project really brought all those other language aspects into it. And I stole a ton from Lisp. The common Lisp object system is the meta object protocol for Moose is heavily based on the meta object protocol for Lisp. So, and that, did that. Let's see what else. I don't know. I brought in a lot from a lot of different languages, as much as I could find. So.
Okay, so you built it. People started to fall in love with it. Started to use it. How did it go on? How did you get more people into this project? You handed it off over to some other people, right?
Yeah. So I think I maintained it for about the first 3 years or so, and then Dave Rolski came along into the channel, and my documentation is always very bad. My spelling, my grammar, everything like that is pretty horrible, and it offended Dave. So Dave went and got a grant to sort of rewrite the manual, or actually write the manual for Moose, but also to rewrite a lot of the other docs. And so he came in and started doing that, and then of course that obviously led to him starting to play with code and this and that. And so sort of after a while, I was sort of getting burned out and tired from maintaining it, and Dave kind of picked it up and went from there. In terms of other people contributing, we did actually have a lot of contributors. Yuval Kogman worked early on a lot with it. Matt Trout has been involved with Moose from day one, although he writes I think he's probably committed maybe at 10 or so commits, very small commits, but he was an advocate for it from the very early days. Marcus Ramberg was around in the early days. Lots of people. Chris Prather, who runs the Orlando Pro Workshop.
Yeah.
He was there. So we sort of had this little community, and it kind of grew out from there. But Dave really came in, took it over, and I sort of stepped back out of there. And Dave's actually, his involvement has started to wane a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years. And Jesse Lures, who's a coworker of mine, he actually has jumped in. He's been the primary maintainer for a while, and actually now Jesse's starting to wane out, and we haven't figured out who's going to be the exact replacement for him, but we do have a new committer, Catherine Etheridge, Ether on IRC. She's just been she was submitting so many patches. We said, hey, here you go, have a maintenance bit, and so potentially she'll be the next person. Who knows? But yeah, it's kind of passed through a number of different hands. I think at this point I wouldn't even recognize some of the internals of it, the code. But I find that very satisfying, handing something off to someone else and letting someone else sort of some fresh blood and some new ideas into what you did. So
how does it work in terms of who decides? Is there a leader who is always the person who has the final say what goes into Moose, or multiple people?
We kind of, I get the final say sometimes, but I usually don't. I won't inject myself too heavily into it. The one thing I've sort of always asked people is to not to add too many more features. Moose has sort of a lot of features, but it also has a lot of extension points. I'd rather see people build extensions outside of the main module and keep the main module sort of smaller and more compact than to sort of start slapping a whole bunch of new features inside of Moose. But in general, I mean, it's a democracy. People argue it out, and usually, it's open source. So he who writes the code, or he or she who writes the code, usually ends up winning because they wrote the code. I'm not going to turn down a patch on something. If people want to put the effort into it and put the time, that's great. And I'm happy.
Okay, but what happens if the patch is something that's ruining basically Moose in some way?
We haven't. I don't think we've really gotten many patches. I mean, that's sort of the beauty of making sure that it's very extensible and having an extension mechanism is that most of the time people will just do it as an extension, and the occasional person who might suggest it as a core feature, we usually just say, well, why don't you make it an extension? And we've actually we have had a little bit of a policy where popular extensions that pretty much the community as a whole starts to use on a regular basis, we've actually cored that into we've brought those into the core of Moose. We've only done it, I think, with one major module, which was it was called attribute traits, and it was the thing that allowed you to call sort of pseudo methods on like array refs and hash refs, stuff like that. There's been talk and plans of coring a few other very popular extensions, but essentially no one's really put up the code for it yet. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think the extensibility really helps in us keeping it slim and smaller in the main core. It allows for people to do what they want to do, and not have to put it into the main distribution.
Isn't there a feeling that some people would say that okay, I would only write this if this can get into the core, because I don't know, because that sounds like more a blast thing, or
I've not heard anybody. I mean, potentially people have said that, but nobody said it to me. So
okay,
yeah, it's interesting.
So that's quite interesting, and you have a totally new project. I read about it a couple of months ago, I think. I don't know, but I haven't heard about it since then. Mo, right?
Yes. So actually, Mo was born out of another project which sort of has gotten stalled, and that other project was called the P5 MOP, and it was essentially an attempt to bring a moose-like object system into the core of Perl. So myself and Jesse Lures were the two primary people working on that, and we basically we were using we used devel declare at one point to try and create a syntax. We ended up switching to devel call parser after that, which proved to be a lot more stable. But we basically ran into a number of walls where it basically looked as if we wouldn't be able to basically without really digging deeply into the core of Perl, we wouldn't be able to put this object system on top of it. And so this and sort of some other philosophical discussions I had with Jesse about, should we be putting more into the core or should we not?
The core of Perl.
The core of Perl, yes.
Okay.
It sort of led to us kind of both being a little discouraged, and so the project sort of got shelved. But this made me start to think of, well, if it's so difficult to get something into the core of Perl, and it's also extremely difficult to get something out of the core of Perl, maybe we need a new core. Maybe we need to think about sort of a new interpreter for Perl. So naturally, your mind might wander to say, well, hey, Perl 6. Perl 6 is sort of a new interpreter for Perl. It's a whole new Perl. It's a new flavor of Perl. And there's a lot of effort underway for that. I know recently Jonathan Worthington just pushed a new version of NQP, which is the sort of core of Perl 6, or the Perl 6 compiler. But he recently pushed something that runs on the JVM. So I know there's a lot of work going on in there, but I wasn't really feeling like I wanted to get back into Perl 6. I really still wanted some of the Perl 5 flavor, because Perl 6 has really evolved over the last, 13 years now. Yeah. And while I really like Perl 6 and I really enjoy Perl 6 and the time I've spent working with Perl 6, I kind of wanted something simpler and something that felt a little bit more like Perl 5 and it was comfortable. And I wanted to write a language. I'd never done it. I wanted to have fun.
Okay, yeah.
So basically this led me to say, hey, why don't I just actually try and do this? I got a book on the internet about how to write a programming language. Started out writing it in Java.
How to write a programming language in 24 hours.
Yeah, it was like one of those one of those books. I always knew theoretically, all the pieces and parts to put it together, but I'd never actually tried to put all the pieces and parts together. So I got this book. It had a little demo thing in there. I started modifying the demo. The demo was sort of a very Ruby-like language. So I started taking that and modifying it and trying to bring it into some Perl syntax. And it worked for a while, but Java's type system can be very restrictive. So I got very frustrated with it, and then at some point I said, hey, I'm going to do this in Scala. And so that was sort of from there was Mo was born. And essentially sort of what I call Mo on the GitHub description is an OFun, optimized for fun, prototype for an ultra-modern Perl 5. And the idea here is just that, I borrowed a lot from Perl 6 for Moose. And so the idea is, well, what if I borrow more from Perl 6, but still try and keep sort of the Perl 5 roots there? And what if I just sort of wrote this as a whole interpreter in and of itself? So, I mean, I announced it pretty loudly, but I've not been very loud about it, which is probably why you haven't heard very much about it. And mostly that's just because I wanted to get the core really solid and in place. And I'm actually feeling like I'm almost there yet. The parser is kind of gross, but we're trying to parse Perl, so you're going to have some grossness in it. But I have a working implementation of test more. So I'm actually writing tests in with the Mo language at this point now. It's become very much closer to Perl 6. People have been calling it a Perl 6 Lite more than Perl 5. We did do things like remove the arrow operator for method calls and replace it with the dot. and basically anytime I run into something and I kind of ask myself, well, what should I do here? I look to see what Perl 6 did,
Okay.
and usually end up going with that route.
So it's a simplified Perl 6.
Yeah, I guess that it's a good way to describe it, but there's a lot of things that I'm not taking from Perl 6, and specifically sticking with the Perl 5 way of doing it.
Okay.
So it's somewhere in the middle, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Okay. Where does it stand? Can people get involved in it right now?
Oh yeah. We have a IRC channel, MOE on irc.perl.org. Yeah, I'm happy to take any contributors. We have one other guy who, and I'm going to totally butcher his name, so I'm not going to try and say it. He's Sahara Dev on IRC.
Okay.
But
just find out his name and then put it down in typing.
Yes, yeah, we can put it in there. No, but so he's been contributing a lot. Basically, every couple of days, I'll sort of sit down on my computer in the morning because I believe he's well, actually, I don't know where. I'm not sure what time zone he's in, but
Okay.
but it seems like every time I come, every couple of days I come in the morning, and boom, there's a big giant pull request from him. He's been implementing a lot of the array operations. Specifically, sort of, it's interesting. He's written a whole bunch of tests that something called 99 problems. I'm not very familiar with it, but it's sort of a whole bunch of little programming problems, and he's sort of implementing each one of those. And each time he gets to a problem where we don't have the right methods or we don't have the right functionality, he implements that functionality and then adds it in there. So it's sort of like example-driven development. It's kind of interesting. But so yeah, it's contributors are always welcome. It's still, like I said, it's still a little rusty in places, but we're getting there. I'm hoping actually by the time YAPC NA rolls around, it'll be in a stable state where people can really sort of jump in and start getting involved.
That's great. And if you already mentioned YAPC North America, then let's just ask you about the Moose class you're going to give there, the Advanced Moose.
Yeah. So
who is it for?
What's that?
Who is it for? So
it's this is actually something we had a client ask us to do a little bit of training, and we'd never really done training before at Infinity. And so we thought, hey, well, that'll be interesting. Let's try it. And we actually had a lot of fun doing that training. But out of that training, we actually did Dave's Moose course that he's going to be giving the first day at YAPC. Yeah. We did that for one day, but they asked us to do a second day of training. So myself, Sean Moore, and Jesse Lures, two of my coworkers, the three of us wrote about 11 hours worth of material, and they're essentially little 50-minute talks, and they're all sort of geared. They kind of take the themes in Dave's class, and they expand upon them. So we have one talk that's all about best practices with roles. We have another talk about how to sort of work with legacy code and Moose and how to integrate Moose into a legacy project. Let's see, we talk about sort of more advanced uses of method modifier, sort of a lot of different things. Actually, there's a little abstracts of each one of the talks on the YAPC website, but basically we did this for a client, and it was a lot of fun. And we thought, hey, let's do this at YAPC and see what, because I know Dave has gotten requests before for a more advanced section, and the end of his class actually does have some advanced topics in there.
Yeah.
But so it seemed like, hey, there might be a market for this, and so it'll be myself and Sean Moore. The two of us will be sort of going back and forth on the different talks. So it should be interesting. Should be fun.
Yeah.
I think we have about 10, maybe 12 people signed up so far. So
that's nice already. Yeah. And we'll still have one more month to go.
Yes.
Great. It was great time with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for taking time.
Okay. So this was the Stevan Little on the Perl Maven show. And my name is Gabor Sabo, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll come back to the next interview. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gabor. Bye-bye.